Live from the Plutopia News Network, this is the Plutopia Happy Hour. Our guest this evening is Julia Browne. The Not Ready for Cable News players are here. John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney, and our director for the evening, Maggie Duvall.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Julia. Welcome.
Hey, Maggie. Hi, John.
Wanted to thank you. You're joining us from Montreal, right?
I am. And thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And you, just briefly, like how I met you was through our friend, mutual friend, Tanya Taylor Rubenstein.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just struck because I have a love of history and historical background and Paris. And then when I found out you had run Walk the Spirit tours in Paris, and did you originate like the first Black history tours in Paris, or were you the first?
That was my claim. That is my claim to fame. I was the first, but you can't rest on your laurels. But yes, I did start the very first ones there. And people said, why? But then some people said, why would you do that? And then other people said, oh boy, what a great idea. So it wasn't even started as a business. It was just something I was really interested in. That was it. I really had no plans behind it whatsoever, except for my own personal satisfaction and sharing that with other people.
So it's kind of like it unfolded as your own personal exploration, right?
Organic, totally organic.
That's amazing. And tell us, like I could have rattled off your bio from your site, but tell us what led you there. What's your background? What got you to this point? And then I want to go back later on and talk about what you're doing now. But take us on a journey, take us on a tour, if you would, and
a tour of your life.
Yeah.
How long have you got?
Oh, we got plenty of time.
Okay. Well, I was born in Leeds in Britain, north of England, Yorkshire. My parents came from the West Indies. They'd immigrated. They were part of that migration from the West Indies, the British West Indies, to the fatherland. That's what it felt like. They were going to the fatherland because in their schools they'd learned everything British. So they were going to, so they got there, and we as children were born, and then eventually those same people that migrated from the West Indies and migrated over to Canada, because in Canada, this was the late 60s, and Canada was wanting to bring in lots of immigrants, but specifically British, because they were kind of favored of the Black people that were trying to get into Canada. The British were, I learned this recently actually. were kind of the favored ones, but so that's how I got to Canada after that, to a small German town called Waterloo.
Okay.
And it used to be called Berlin before the wars. It was everything German. Like,
wow.
Honestly, it has the largest Oktoberfest outside of Munich to this day. Yeah, like super German. So yeah, learning German in school, and we were the only Black kids in our school, out on our street, in our church.
Wow.
So, it was just part of par for the course. It was normal. It was normal for us. Had no idea. Well, when we lived in England, actually, we lived in neighborhoods. There were a lot of other Black people, Black and white, and everybody else is Polish. And the funny thing was, when we lived in England, we lived beside Polish people. When we moved to Canada, we lived beside Polish people. So I feel like I was always surrounded by Polish people. It's a strange idea. Anyway, so so I grew up in Canada from the age of 8.5, but I always had a thing for traveling. So when I was about 11, I entered a contest to do a year abroad in Norway. I didn't think twice about it. It sounded like a great adventure.
Of course,
Norway. It sounded like it was going to be fun.
Yeah.
I didn't win, but it kind of, that's kind of started. My mother probably said, uh-oh, from that point forward. And she was right to say that, because by the time I got to, 16, I was doing study abroad or exchange programs in Quebec so I could learn French. And that continued on. And eventually I went to study tourism, studied English. and ended up as a flight attendant. So, you know, there's a thread going through. It's just
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
gotta get out of Dodge, right? I just
It's
gotta
like,
go
yeah.
through the world. And I just like to be where, see how other people live. I like to live in different places. I like to try new things and try new lifestyles. So
Mhm.
that eventually took me to Montreal, and to study in France, where I met the man that became my husband, back to Montreal, and then back to Paris. And that's where I started doing these tours in 1990. We finally moved back to Paris in 1990 after a stint in Montreal again.
Okay.
And and I've been living there 4 years, no, maybe 3 years. And I was taking a course at the Sorbonne, and somebody told me which course specifically which course I should start with. And my professor turned out to be the man who was the expert in African American history and culture in France. He
Whoa.
actually started the Center for African American Studies at the
Whoa.
Sorbonne University. So he
Okay.
became my mentor. And in the course of things, he had this written with the help of the students, a street guide to African Americans in Paris. And I took this guide and I walked around the neighborhood with it. And in my neighborhood, it turns out that Langston Hughes had lived there. So I'd read his
Whoa.
story. Yeah. The fun thing was, in the early 1990s, the apartment buildings, you could just get into them. There was no digicode, like you put in a special code. There was none of that.
Yeah.
You just had to, the trick was, if you wanted to get in, what I did was I just watched for a couple of days. I watched the concierge and see when she went for lunch. And so when she went into her little area for lunch, I snuck in and went right up to the top.
Right on.
So then I was able to stand in front of Langston Hughes' doorway where he wrote jazz poetry and all that. It was like, it was like, wow, this is I would have had to go to Harlem. He became the poet laureate of Harlem eventually. I would have had to go to all these cities, to Chicago, to New York, to all these different places to meet all the people that were in this little slim book that started it all off for me. And it was all in one city, and I could walk from one to another. So this was the bright light. And this is what, like I said, I tend to move around. This anchored me in Paris. This is something that became something that I really wanted to attach to, that made me feel that Paris was a place like I had roots, even though I'm not African American. It's still, Black roots and part of the Black story. So that's how I started.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I got to this.
And what was the lightning bolt that said, I'm going to just start doing this for other people?
I kind of slid into it because when I took this book and I started writing these cue cards out, and then I would just kind of walk around, and then I started telling my friends, hey, did you know that this and this happened here? This person did this here. And they said, oh yeah, why don't you take us? And so I said, sure. I was part of a women's group and sisters. And so I took them around from place to place. And then they said, oh, I got cousins coming in, or my aunts coming in, or can you show them? I said, sure, no problem. I had a day job, so it wasn't, I didn't really rely. I don't even know if I made the people pay, or maybe I did a little bit, but
yeah.
But that point too, that people would put money into my hand, and all I did was walk around and show them this and that, and it was pure pleasure.
Share your love. Yeah.
It was amazing. So but even then, it took a little while for me to really sink into it and go, yeah, maybe I should do, make this regular, because then I started getting some press coverage and things like that. And I thought, okay, well, let's do this on the weekend and see where it goes. And people were so grateful. They were so grateful. They'd come up to me with something that they read in the Washington Post or something like that, and they'd have the paper in front of them, and they'd look at me and then, oh wait, it is you. And it was like, this is interesting. Wow. It's not something I expected, but it was very gratifying that I could, give this to people, and that I could make something of Paris that was this beautiful, iconic, very much wrapped up in its own history, but I could find another way to give something from it, to draw something out of it, and then give something back to it myself.
Julia, you mentioned your interest was sparked by an African-American expatriate. Is there a great deal of interest in finding out and visiting these sites of these expatriate American Blacks that are people really wanting to learn more about why they were there, what they did?
Absolutely, absolutely. You can't underestimate the feeling of growing up Black in Canada or United States. I'll just stick to United States. Growing up Black where you don't feel valued, where your culture isn't valued, where you're treated as a second-rate citizen for the most part, and then you go and travel around the world almost expecting that kind of treatment elsewhere if you haven't traveled anywhere, and then you get there and you have history there. You have deep history there, and the history has been respected because the African American soldiers were the one that introduced jazz to Europe. So jazz, you have more jazz in Europe, more jazz festivals than you have probably anywhere else. So that's still respected. And a person like Josephine Baker is still, they put her on a stamp, and she was still very, very respected. So to go from how you are classified in the United States to a place where you're valorized is a leap. It's a huge leap and bounds. And then you can follow these people's stories and chart their evolution. And even if they only stayed there a year or two, something came out of it because it was something they could take back with them to the United States, and then use it to the best of to better their community or their people around them.
Well, and there were so many great jazz players who made a point of going to Paris and playing there, and were acknowledged there in a way that they never were here in the U.S.
Absolutely.
And I think that was a huge boon for them. And really, Paris did so much for jazz just because they appreciated it. And they appreciated the people who were making the music who, as you say, here in the U.S. were certainly not as appreciated. And there were just a couple of places in the U.S. where jazz had real prominence, like New York and maybe on the West Coast too.
And I think that's a good segue into Paris Noir, the whole documentary. Tell us about the documentary and give us a kind of a summary of the trajectory. Because one thing I did want to touch on, and thanks for bringing that up, Scoop, and adding to that, John, was that there was this ability for the culture to flower in Paris and for people to see themselves for the first time in a way, like you expressed, that what didn't happen in the US. So give us a little bit of background about the documentary, how you got involved in it, and like a summary of it, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay. The documentary is called Paris Noir, African Americans in the City of Light. And it is actually the third one that these filmmakers, Joanne and David Burke, put out. They're from New York. They're filmmakers. Joanne was an editor, a well-known editor in New York, and David, her husband, was a producer for 60 Minutes. They went over to Paris to take a sabbatical, a year off, and that was 1986. And 1987 didn't come for them. They just stayed. They just stayed on. But they were jazz fans. They grew up in the jazz era, 40s and 50s. So jazz was a big thing for them. So it was natural for them to start filming the community, the jazz community in Paris. So that's where they started making these films from their background. And so what the film does, it covers. They started actually making short films, a series of short films, little 6 and 7 minute films. One on the soldiers that went over in the First World War, a particular Lieutenant James Brissier, who was the band leader, who said, that they appreciate his music, our music, the African American music, and not being played in some other way. And so it covers the war. And then it goes into the artist, the 1920s, what led from the soldiers going back home and telling how well they were treated in France and how they were invited into homes and how people, jazz was just demanded everywhere, it just exploded. how it became the soundtrack of, you know, the new generation coming in. So they went home and they told people and they wrote letters home, and more people started coming over. So then more musicians started coming over in the 1920s, and then the Harlem Renaissance writers followed them. So there were probably more Harlem Renaissance writers in Paris in the 20s, and probably, or at least the elite were in Paris than back in New York. And then writers, so the writers, the artists, entertainers, artists, both men and women coming on grant. So they all came in the 1920s. So the film covers that whole period, but it also, into that period comes, just at the end of that period comes individual people who actually left a mark, like Josephine Baker, like Bricktop, the entertainer, whose club was a place where people of all classes, all social statuses, all kind of professions, like writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald and what's his name, Hemingway, would come. Gloria Swanson, the actress, would come. It was just a place where everybody gathered, and she connected everybody in the community. So that's what the 20s was like, and the film goes through all of that, and then takes you out the end of into the 30s when things start to fall apart. But there are still African Americans left there until the Germans marched in, and then you really had to be out. And then it takes a leap over then to the Second World War, with the next wave of soldiers, the GIs come, and with them they bring, and then at that same time comes in the new music, bebop. So a whole new phase of the love affair with jazz starts again, and then the city is divided in two camps. Either you're for bebop or you're for big band sound. So, but there was choice. There was so much choice because all of the best musicians had moved over, or they were attending the jazz festivals. So the film continues on and like an epilogue in that, and then the writers like Richard Wright and James Baldwin coming over in the late 1940s and into the 50s. So the film takes us right up to that period, covers the whole arc of why they came, you know, yes, escaping racism and segregation, but the opportunity to put their talents to use. For example, the artists, they could study, most of them came on grants or bursaries from foundations, American foundations, and they could study right alongside the Europeans, right alongside the French. And there was no division between them, which was the complete opposite of where they'd come from. And they could learn from the best teachers. You know, Paris was the center of the art world at the time, right? So you couldn't get any closer to genius. And then they had their own genius, and they were allowed to explore it, but in an atmosphere where they didn't have to explore it as Black people or from a Black perspective. It was just from their perspective. And quite often, being in that area, that environment to explore what was really in their heart, they came back to the Black focus, but from a different from an African angle. From this time, being Africans for the first time at the World Fairs, while the French are showing off their colonial conquest. African Americans are going to these colonial exhibitions and seeing their diaspora brothers from the diaspora for the first time. So the film covers all of that, and it brings in some of the Afro-French or the former colonialized countries, like from Africa, but also from the West Indies, like Aimé Césaire, and then there's from the future president of Senegal, Leopold Senghor. So all of this is happening at the same time. So you can imagine how exciting that was, the kind of people that you would meet and the inspirations that you would get. So Paris was like, it was like a bubbling, and even if you didn't stay there that long, you got some of it and took it back with you, and your work was all the better for it. But you were all the better for it, and the way you saw yourself and civil rights, the force behind the civil rights, some of it comes out of this situation that African Americans found themselves in Paris, and the force that comes out of just being able to do what you want, the right thing to do, and having the perspective to think about it, get it right, and then come forward with it.
Yeah, and it really, the documentary is fascinating. I loved it, and that excitement comes through, just like it's coming through with you, and that whole ability to just completely open the channels and the floodgates go. I mean, you know, just feeling like, what would it be like if I can just create the way?
What do you do with freedom? What do you do with freedom if you've never had it? Right?
Absolutely. And how that like a feedback loop, it just kept coming back and forth between there and here in America, and how profound that is. And, you know, and I highly recommend everybody has to see that, that film, and we'll have the links to that as well. But how about sharing a few of your favorite stories? You know, whatever comes to mind. Favorite.
Oh, heavens.
Yeah. I know you can so, I mean, it's just like, I can't absorb enough between, you know, the film and what you shared.
I was associate producer on the film. That means I was kind of an advisor. So they would, you know, ask me, what was this like? What was that like? I'm also in the film. Now, you probably wouldn't recognize me. I was like young and fresh, and it was a couple of years ago. But the filmmakers are actually making another one on the World War I soldiers, and it's just about done. So,
oh, good. What's that one going to be called?
It's going to be, oh my goodness, don't ask me. Fighting for Freedom? No. Oh, I have to look. I'll have to look. The trailer is on the site. It's on the website. Yeah, African Americans in Paris. Yeah. So my favorite stories, you know, there are so many. You know, what's the point of the story? Is what's the outcome of that story? Why is it one of my favorites? One of my favorites is the artist Nancy Elizabeth Prophet. She she's an artist. There it is. You can see Fighting for Freedom. Is that what it's called? The documentary, Fighting for Respect. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, wow. Right on.
There it is. Yeah. It's beautiful. It's really well done. So Nancy Elizabeth Prophet, she was a sculptor trained at the Rhode Island School of Design. And she worked, you know, she fought foot and, what's the term? She fought hard anyway, whatever the term is, to get to Paris. She fought tooth and nail. That's it. and finally got to Paris about 1924, 25, I want to say. And it was really hard for her when she got there, because she had very little money when she got there. Money disappeared quite quickly, but also because she chose to work in sculpture, it was a very expensive medium. And so sometimes she would go, you know, days without eating. And you'll see in the film, there's a anecdote where at one point she was so hungry that when a friend invited over, she ate what was in the dog food bowl, you know, and it was like heaven sent kind of thing. But she worked really hard, and she would use people that were for her models, that people that she'd see at the cafe. So those faces, she would model their faces. And then she was one of those who went to the colonial exhibition and saw the African arts and the sculptures for the first time. And then she started sculpting those faces. And by the time she left, she was there 12 years, so probably the longest of all the artists there. By the time she left, she was selling her work in the United States, you know, to the Whitney Foundation and things like that. So it was a hard slog for her, but it was mentally difficult because a lot of the time she was alone. So she wasn't really social. So she kept a lot to herself. One of her pieces is called Silence. It's just to tell you that she just had no back and forth with people, but it was worth it. And in the end, and then she went on to co-found the first visual arts department at Spelman College, which is Berkeley Black College in Atlanta.
Yeah.
And so she went on to do that. So that's one of the examples of, you know, really putting in the time, putting in the time and the effort, but the hard work, and then coming up with something beautiful at the end, something that positive to give back, something that benefited the life then of young visual artists coming up. Who else a story? I like so many of the stories. I tend to go towards women. I like bricktop stories. I like
That's
Bricktop's because you don't hear too much about Bricktop, but she was just so very, she was a real connector type of person. She well, the story goes that for her to get over, she was well known in Chicago and New York before she came over as a singer, as an entertainer. But you know, everybody wanted to go to Paris, and she had big dreams. She wanted to own her own club, and that wasn't going to happen in New York in the 1920s, so early 1920s. So apparently, she intercepted a letter of invitation for another singer to come over to Paris, and she just brought that old letter over and said, "Here I am." She arrived there and into this club called Le Grand Duc, and it was a small little place. She'd come from working in big clubs, and she saw this little club, like barely 12 tables, and she goes, "Oh my goodness." But it worked out for her. Langston Hughes was working in the back, and he brought her, you know, a cup of tea. She sat down, and then she got on with it, and she turned out to be a kind of person that the ambiance in Montmartre at the time where this was, Montmartre is where, when you think of Montmartre, of Paris, and think of the Moulin Rouge cabaret, and you think of those kind of the nightlife at the turn of the century, the wildness, you know, the wine and the women, the can girls, it just, everything kind of just went. And then you have the artists, you know, everybody's impoverished up there, but wine is cheap. Up there. So that's a kind of atmosphere that's up there. And then you have the jazz music that's settling down the hill a little bit. And then all the little jazz clubs, all the little French clubs, all of a sudden they want jazz musicians in there, because that's what the people want. People want to they just want to let loose to the jazz, because jazz was joyful, it was new, it was lively, it was a new generation of music. And so they'd come out of the war only recently, so they just wanted to let go. So in this neighborhood, there's all these little jazz clubs, and hers is one of the one that she worked is one of them. But the people that go up there that have the money to spend, they're usually like I mentioned, some movie stars, some writers, but a lot of international personalities and aristocrats. So they've got all money, and usually those people don't mix. But they did at Bricktops, because she had that kind of personality that everybody was equal in her club, right? Even if you were the performer, you were at the same level. You were sitting at next to the table with your monsieur so-and-so. And so she kept that all even in her club, and people really appreciated that she made them feel welcome. So when she went, she had her little club, that little club she landed at with little 12 tables. And then she had philanthropists behind her to help her fund her next move, and she moved right across the street and opened a bigger place, and all the people just followed her over there to that club. But what's interesting is what happened in that club. The same kind of people. Have you seen the movie Midnight in Paris? Okay, if you ever see the movie Midnight in Paris, there's a scene where it takes place in a club in Montmartre, and it's her club. But she opens it, she with the help of her financial backers, like Cole Porter, for example, she opens a new club, and she's got lots of people coming in. But the people that weren't coming to the first club, that are coming to the second one, are young French musicians who are suddenly enamored with jazz, with this new music. It wasn't quite, it wasn't a respected music yet. It was like a pop, considered like pop music at the time, you know, in the mid 19th,
when Elvis Presley was.
Yeah, like it's not gonna last. Like it's just a thing, like a young people thing. You know, we thought rap and hip hop wouldn't last, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, so there's young people starting to come into her club, and they're how can we learn this music? And so eventually there's a club that builds up later in the 1920s of young French musicians, and they want to make jazz into a music to be studied. So they create jazz magazines, come out of that, and they start recording the jazz musicians there. So that all starts because you've got young people starting to come to her club, and then are taking the music and trying to make it something, trying to play it themselves. Because at the time, it was only African Americans who could play jazz. It was a specifically African American art form. So when we talk about international jazz, when we talk about French jazz, it comes out of Bricktop's club, because the people that were coming in then took it to the next step. So when I say that Bricktop was a connector, things happened around her, and she facilitated that. So that's why I like her story too. Even though her story is not very well known, it's a community story.
Oh man, are there any, has anybody done any biographies or documentaries just on her?
On her, well, there's a biography, and I'm sure there's a couple of books out. There's a book
Okay.
called, I think it's in my bedside table. It's called Bricktops, and it's the author, I can't remember her name, but a really good book. It's
Okay.
half documentary, and then it's half part of it's fictionalized as well.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
yeah,
Okay.
I think it's called Bricktops. I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because I just love, I love anybody that's a connector, and just that I'm just blown away by that as well. And I love, how, just how that you mentioned the women, Black women being able to be on this completely wholly other level in
Yeah.
Paris. Who are some of your other favorite
Oh,
Black?
there she is. There's Bricktop.
Okay,
And you see
right.
she's got freckles. You see she's got freckles, right? She was apparently she was half Irish and half Black, and they called her Bricktop, right? Because she had kind of reddish
Wow.
hair, but apparently also because she had a temper as well. Yeah, and some of the women that came through her club were very became very influential women. They were often traveling alone, so they could go to Bricktops and knew that they'd be safe there, and they could meet other women who were also traveling alone. And so it was a space for that, where other women who were musicians could come and perform there. So it was that kind of a space. Other women. Let me think. Oh, uh, Lois Mailou Jones was a painter. Let me just think. Have I covered everybody else? Writers, painters. Um, Lois Mailou Jones took a sabbatical from Howard University and went over to paint. So she went over, and she was the last African American artist actually to go over. So we're talking about the 1930s, and there she had an enormous talent already established talent. And you'd see her painting. They would see her painting down by the Seine River and in the streets, and people would stop and admire her work. And this is the kind of feedback or appreciation that she never got at home, back in the States, that anybody would stop her on the street and just say, wow, your work is fabulous, or, c'est merveilleux, they would say something like that, or vraiment bien, madame, that kind of thing. And so she was painting people, again, that she could see around her. You'd see people at, like the Impressionist painters, or the painters from the turn of the century, and into the 20s, they painted people in bars, for example. They painted people in ordinary situations, and that's what she did, until, again, she too got connected into the African diaspora arts that were brought out of Africa. They were looted from Africa, but you could readily see them at these World's Fairs. But also they created the Museum of Man, which is near the Eiffel Tower, called Trocadero. It's Museum of Man, and it's called now, I think it's the Musée de l'Homme. I think it's called that, Museum of Man. And they used to stash them, all of the pieces that they brought out, and they said they were bringing them and holding them there for scientific study, so they could study the size of the brain and just determine whether the Negro was, that word was had the size of a brain, big enough to be intelligent. So that's what they were using all that for. But she had a chance to look at some of the pieces, and she started painting, again, masks and very, very evocative, very strong African themed paintings, and yeah. And then she went on from there, and I think she married a man from Haiti. And so that was part of her personal evolution as well.
Okay.
Julia, is there one particular expatriate that people on your tours always ask about, always have an interest in?
Josephine Baker.
Mm-hmm.
Always, because she was so not only because she spent the rest of her life, she moved there when she was 19, and then she spent the rest of her life there and died in 1975, sorry. But she evolved so much. She became French. She became more French than more than American, and the French claimed her as one of their own. You know, she might have been born in America, but she's ours, that kind of thing. But she started out as a showgirl, and when people, like especially students, listen to the stories about her, study her, sometimes they have trouble with, you know, the decisions that she made, the shows that she did, how she dressed in the show, that she accepted to be, you know, do the banana dance and that kind of thing. But, you know, you have to look at it at the time. The times were different, the experiences were different, expectations. But there's also the fact that you doing these kind of, being asked to dance in a certain way, or you see posters of exaggerations of Black images, of Black faces, the caricatures. Are you able to stand that? Are you able to look on at the side of that allows you to stay in a country where you have all the freedoms in the world? Or would you rather hold that and then take it back to the States with you? So there's a price to pay for everything, right? And I'm, so Josephine, some of the choices she made, but then she evolved from there. She went on to become a diva. She learned French. She learned elocution. She got elocution lessons with the man that who became her business partner, and she uplifted herself, like literally lifted up herself. She was wearing all of the designers would design for her. So she was the most elegant of elegance. And her presence was demanded everywhere. She ended up having her own restaurant, like by the time she was 21. And then she went on from there, and you think, okay, well, she's done that. She's an entertainer all the way. No, she shifts again. And there's something that happens in New York that makes her want, used to refuse service at the Stork Club. She gets back to France in the 1930s, and she is so grateful to be back in Paris, back in France. What can I do for France? She asks, and the army says to her, "You have something that we could use." She rented a chateau in the south of France in a town called Castelnau. And she rented this chateau, and when the war broke out, she allowed them to use this chateau for resistance fighters to filter through it, so she could hide them in there. But she also had secret messages in her clothing. Nobody was going to search the famous Josephine Baker. She was the most well-known woman entertainer in Europe at the time, so nobody would search her. But and then she would listen she would spy. She was carrying espionage, right? So people would be talking all around her, and they didn't expect the frivolous Josephine Baker to be listening or to be able to understand German, and she did.
Right? Yeah.
So she carried the messages. Wow. And then from there you think, okay, what's next for Josephine? She's going to go off into glory. She gets the Legion of Honor and all that. No, she embodies the French values of liberty, equality, and freedom. But it's not something she sets out to do intentionally and says, this is my next goal. It's just who she is. She's that kind of a generous, warm-hearted person. And she wants to have children. And she finds out when she's in the hospital during the war, she can't have children. So she sets out to adopt children from all different parts of the world. And this is where the brotherhood parts. And then she wants to prove that people, especially children from all different nationalities, can live together. And so the 12 different children, all different nationalities, and she proved it, that they could all live together. They've grown up. Of course, they're all in their 70s, probably 70s by now. And they're all, from what I know, they're all still very much in contact with each other. They're all very, very close. So she proved that. And that was one of the French values. And that's why when the French loved her, because she embodied their values. And then from there, you think, okay, well, she can't do any better. Yep, she gets it. She buys that chateau in the south of France, and she brings up her children there, but then she loses it. She goes bankrupt. And yes, they are the Rainbow Tribe. So kind of like Angelina Jolie and Madonna and all that. She was the first one. I'm not saying that it was a picnic for the kids, because they were on display because she had something to prove, right? They had, down to the chateau, they had a theme park, and people would come. This huge theme park at a time when theme parks didn't even exist. So
Wow.
at her chateau, they had like she had a hotel segment, they had swimming pools, they had golf course, restaurants, and people would drive in on the weekends to experience this. So she had dreams that were this, you know, and it was the city of brotherhood that she was building. So she wasn't that good with money, and it wasn't great for all that great for the kids, but there you were. There you are.
How long did she live?
She was born in 1906 and she died in 1975. So.
Okay, and she came from a pretty tough background, didn't she?
Yep. Her mother was a washerwoman. I don't think she knew her father, and she started dancing apparently for pennies when she was about 5, 6 years old and entertaining people. And she worked since she was very young, but she was always very focused on what she wanted, and she was always very determined. And she was able to get onto a dance troupe while she was underage, and that took her to New York. And it was when she was in New York that this American woman was putting together a show for a theater in Paris, 1924. And it was a time when all the theaters in Paris wanted to have Black entertainment because it was the big thing. Yeah. And so this woman was putting together a show and she brought them all over. And that's where Josephine came into the picture. She was in the chorus, but because of she had a strong comic sense. So she made people laugh, but the way she moved her body and that, and that she just, the cream rises to the top kind of thing.
Yeah.
But she didn't let that cream settle because she just took it and ran with it.
Yeah.
She did not.
Comedy and the charisma.
Yeah. And the charisma she had. Yeah, natural charisma. Absolutely.
Yeah.
She was something.
Wow.
And that's why people are still fascinated with her today. She's got an amazing story.
Yeah.
But she was true to herself.
And is there, you talked about down from Noir and there was different, or is this all over Paris? Is there certain sort of districts where there was kind of a concentration?
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you go to Paris and you do a tour, and if you wanted to start at the beginning, you could start in the theater area around the Luxembourg Gardens. That's where like, for example, Alexandre Dumas, he's not African-American, but he is of Black ancestry. His plays would be put on, and some of the theater people would perform there. But the first big step was, up in Montmartre, and then down at the other end, completely other end of the city, in Montparnasse, down the south end of the city, where the writers like Hemingway, like F. Scott Fitzgerald, like Ezra Pound, like all of that gang, Samuel Beckett, they all hung around in the cafes down in Montparnasse. And it was down there that the art schools were. So while the musicians were up in the upper part of the city, the artists were in this lower part of the city, near the writers. So that's Montparnasse is that area down there for arts and for the certain literary output. But then you move up into the center of the city where most people start out in Paris, around the Latin Quarter and the Saint-Germain-des-Prés area, right near the big landmark. There would be the Notre Dame Cathedral, the Conciergerie, the Ile Notre Dame. People often go to Shakespeare and Company bookstore, which is right there across the river. So right there in that area is where the Black writers lived and worked there, and up towards the Luxembourg Gardens and into the next district over. And then that's also just a little bit to the right in the next district over, in what's called Saint-Germain-des-Prés, is where jazz settled after the Second World War. So in the First World War, it was in Montmartre. And then after Second World War, it settled in the center, in the Saint-Germain-des-Prés area. Okay. So where the French existentialists used to gather and hang out. And now they have all those literary cafes that people go and hang out with, because the writers used to hang out there too. After that, that's where the beboppers settled in that area too. So Montmartre in the top, Montparnasse in the bottom, Latin Quarter and Saint-Germain in the middle. And then there's up and down the Champs-Élysées, towards the Arc of Triumph. But there's a bit of some history there, of course. But those were the main centers.
Is there a stop on your tours that really surprises people, something that they really didn't expect?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me run this through my mind here.
Or is it a particularly unusual stop that,
Unusual.
that really, gets to people?
Wow. Yeah.
That really wows them. Well, I think when people see the markers, they get wow, because it's a moment to take pictures, but it's also a moment of focus. There's not a lot of markers, even though there's a lot of African American history. There are not as many. There's a marker in front of on the house where Richard Wright used to live, near the Luxembourg Gardens. There's a marker now where Josephine Baker had her first club. Up in the Montmartre district, there's a marker where near the theater where she did her last show in the Montparnasse in the South district. And then now there's more markers for Caribbean people like Amy Césaire and Leopold Senghor and the Nardal sisters, who were intellectuals. So I think it's the markers that really galvanize people, that really, then it feels really concrete, because we walk the street and we tell stories. We stop at this cafe, and that people will go back to the cafe just to kind of commune with the spirit, but when you see a marker, you've got something concrete there, right? I'm trying to think of, I can't think of off the top of my head something that's really surprising.
Do you get a lot of children that are on the tours, and is their reaction different from the adults?
Oh yeah, we do get children. We don't get tons of children, but sometimes we get school groups that come over, like from the charter schools from the US. And we've had as young as 5. But what we do is we prepare a workbook for them, because it's, you talk and you talk, they may not know the names, and we help the parents to prepare it a little bit. But what we want to do is to give them the sense of the physical place, that this is what it would look like if this person was here and was able to accomplish this. So their reaction is more making a game of it. And then they go back and we give them a little book to remember, and that it's we get a lot of university groups, and so they usually have been prepared in advance, and the teacher's given them some work to do. But we get university groups from across Europe as well, and it's for them, it's to be able to, again, the physical, because they've studied the books, they've studied the theories, but to actually see it, and to put a place to a theory and a story means a lot, actually. So I think it's very important that a lot of the teachers, they really make it a point that the students actually walk through the environment and feel the environment.
And excuse me, how it has, besides the obvious, how has COVID affected your business and maybe catalyze new ideas and new plans of what you're going to do next?
Okay, well, everything kind of just stopped. Boom. It just stopped. Like, it was just, I remember it was just about St. Paddy's Day. And all of a sudden we had to get people home who were stranded overseas. And then after that, we had to cancel all the bookings that we'd made, people who had been making trips into September and that. And so that was a bit of a panic for a while. And then there's no new bookings, right? So, because people can't travel. And so it's been a good year that there has been very few bookings. And then we can't even, people are traveling around their country, but I live in Canada. So people are traveling within their province, but we can't necessarily travel to the next province over. So very restricted. So I just I stopped doing any kind of travel planning whatsoever. There was no point to it. And I thought it was just as well better for people to stay home anyway. So where I turned my attention to, I wrote a book on traveling during COVID. for people that were going to the different states or to even going to your next town over. So I did that, and then started making new plans with you, Maggie, to create a resource center. So I realized that, you know, what people don't have a lot of is everything in one place as far as this history goes. So it's not just Paris, but it's, you know, Canadian Black history, some of the US Black history. So where do you go to get all this information? Where do you get to go to listen to people talk about it? Where can you find books? Where can we be active in it? You know, and so this is what I'm working on. I'm also doing, I started doing production of video tours. So these started out as tours for people that were nostalgic about Paris and were wishing they could go back, but people would have had plans to go. And this is what you would have seen, but from, you know, with the Black history integrated into it. And it started out as somebody asked me to do it for a gift for their niece and nephew. And then after that, people started, you know, asking me to do more of them. And it is, wow, it is such a, you know, they start out being 5 minutes, so we're making them a little bit longer now, but it is such a, you know, it's almost as pleasurable as doing the tour, because we personalize them for every person. So, you know, I asked them, what is it that you want to see in Paris? Or what is it that you saw in Paris? What do you do in life? What is it, you know, what is it that you know, one woman used to be a fabric designer, so we did it all around that. Another person wanted, you know, around the 1970s fashion in Paris. And so we do the research, and then me and the editor put together a really nice film, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time. You try to really craft them beautifully so that people sit down and go, oh my goodness, not so much, not even that they necessarily want to go, but they just feel that they've been somewhere, that it's just for them. And so it's a beautiful gift, and it's like I said, like doing the tour, something that I can give to people that just lifts up the spirit a bit. So that's what we're doing, and we're just, you know, it's we're pumping up the production, because people are really interested in.
It's you hit on something. You hit on a need and a want, and people can reach out to you on your website, right? Not only for that, but also for the booklet that you created about traveling during COVID. So
but we're starting people. But hey, this week, in the last 2 weeks, we've had more requests for travel planning than before. So we have to ramp up the machine again, right? So I have to start hiring back staff and all that. So it's businesses, people are anxious to go, but we feel like the end is in sight. So business is continuing as before, but not as before. We're going to be so much more conscious, and I think people are going to go where they have family, where they have a personal connection, and it's something they've always wanted to do. So, but I think the family thing, like my mother-in-law just died like last week. I was heartbroken that I couldn't go to the funeral, and so my first trip is going to be to be over there beside and stand by her graveside. I think the trips are going to become so much more personal and purposeful, and that's where, even I was doing that before, but that's where I really want to.
It's like sinking into deeper meaning, real sense of place for connection. That's fascinating, because I'll be curious to follow where that goes, and you know, perhaps you wouldn't have had these insights without the pause time.
Listen, you know, I'm sorry, but I was grateful for the pause time. I really was. You know, I'm not apologizing at all, but it was nice, because we were going full tilt for years and years. So it was nice to settle back for a little while. But you know, that's done.
And you know, you were talking about like the resource site for Black culture all over the place, right? Are you expanding your in real life tour business, like linking in with other groups around the country, around the world?
We already do. We have partners in other European countries. I work with some of the people that have heritage sites here in Canada. We have a
Mhm.
tour in Washington, D.C. that we've been doing, and that's an excellent site. So yeah, we've already started that. That's a natural outtake of it.
Mhm.
You know, thinking of other countries as well that had a Black presence, like Morocco, Martinique,
Mhm.
Montreal, all over. So the sky's the limit, and
Mhm.
it's just about connecting. You know, just connecting into that thread. No matter whatever your background is, it's a place to connect, just to dive right in.
We have
Yeah.
a question from somebody on Facebook, from Ursa Davis. How do you identify and research the subjects and sites on your tours?
Libraries, libraries online. I read an enormous amount, and I have a good library that unfortunately I can't carry with me everywhere. But I'm a natural researcher. I love research. I love reading, and so it's all research. And of course, talking with other people who know the subject as well, and really keeping in contact with people in other countries who are doing the same kind of work, and sharing information that way too.
Mhm. I'm gonna, right before we did this, I just got off a 2-hour conversation with the New Mexico Acequia Association. Acequias are the ancient farm canals, you know, in New Mexico, but they're in like Morocco and all that. Anyway, it's the connection to the land that the people have here. And so it made me weep because it was about reaching out to the children in these communities to inspire them to come back to the acequias, to find their place within the system, the healing through the land, the community, and all that. And this one little girl said, she was talking about her doll, her Josefina doll. I think it's an American Girl doll, but she said, yeah, and you're seeing it from the perspective of Josefina, who grew up right where I am now. And she tells you what it was like when the Americans showed up and how everything changed. And anyway, that kind of made my head explode in the thought of, you know, I was like looking forward to talking with you tonight. I think that not only, I just think that there's going to be something there's a kind of a shift of, you know, turning things upside down, and people from all cultures are gonna and races are gonna start having hope. I'm just feeling it, this hunger to learn more, you know, like what's beneath the surface of the narratives
Yeah.
we've been taught. It's what I always hated. I was bored to death with you know, Virginia history. It's like, oh my God, you know, like and I'm really excited about that. I feel like you're poised at this amazing place that, you know, that's coming forward. So I'll be really excited to, you know, watch what happens.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in you know, I've been talking a lot about African Americans, but in the Afro-French community, that's really huge and really and taking over. I mean, the African American history in Paris is like that big. It's influential, but it's that big. It's the
Yeah.
Afro-French story that's the prevalent one now, and very much should be. So we're digging into that, and I love that I can connect with people who are part of that story, and our guides are part of that story too.
Mhm.
So yeah, people are getting down to their roots, just really,
Mhm.
so again, something that's really meaningful, and again, the next generation too, taking
Yeah.
it forward, and you know, learning from us elders, and keeping the thread between the generations, which is
That's
really
right.
important.
Yeah, there was, you know, one of the sites that I learned about through this conversation was it's called Manitos, and it's people starting to share their stories. You know, their stories of their ancestors, their abuela and their abuelita, and just finally, again, shifting the narrative. So
But the value of the elders' stories too, the value coming back of that, yeah.
yeah.
And realizing that without it, we don't have much to hang on to, because we don't even know, you don't know where you come from, but you
Mhm.
don't know why you do certain things, and you don't have a connection to anything in particular, but you need the connection.
Mhm. Well, we're almost ready to wind up, but I wanted to, there was another question I want to ask earlier when you were talking about the artist. I'm sorry, kind of circling back. When there was that explosion of the exploration of African art and the masks and all that, were there particular countries or regions in Africa that were most influential, or was kind of a little bit of everything?
Well, the ones that came into France were coming from the French colonialized countries there. So those were the ones there.
Like Senegal and Algeria.
No, not so much Algeria. That was more North African. Senegal and Cameroon and the Ivory Coast, countries like that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And okay, we're almost finished. Any final parting words you'd like to share with the audience? Anything you know, we'll be putting your links up, but what would you like us to know?
Dig deep when you travel, dig deep, ask questions, why certain things are there, why certain cultures are there, because these countries that we're traveling to, they're not the old countries anymore. People are migrating. People have always migrated, but there's more migration today, more visibly than everywhere else. And everybody belongs where they are, because no one country has the monopoly on that space where they're in anymore. So be open to the new personality of the country that you're going to.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us tonight. And I hope you join us again. You know, in next phase, let's see what comes up next in your projects and your work, and we'll have you on again.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you
so
very
much.
much for inviting me, Maggie. Thank you, John. Thank you, Scoop.
It's been great. Okay, bye everybody.
Bye.
Off
Thank
we
you.
go.